For decades during the Cold War, the CIA searched for a single face it could not find. While Soviet intelligence officers were regularly photographed, identified, and tracked, one man remained completely invisible. His name was Markus Wolf, a senior intelligence officer closely connected to the KGB and the head of East Germany's Foreign Intelligence Service. Inside the CIA, he was not viewed as just another adversary. He was considered one of the most dangerous intelligence officers in the world, not because of what he said publicly, but because of what he managed to hide. Markus Wolf operated in a space where secrecy itself became a weapon. Unlike many intelligence leaders who relied on visibility and bureaucratic power, Wolf built his influence through anonymity. For more than 20 years, Western intelligence agencies possessed no confirmed photograph of him. CIA analysts referred to him as the man without a face. This absence was not accidental. It was the result of disciplined tradecraft, strict operational security, and a deep understanding of how Western intelligence worked. Wolf understood that intelligence services often focused on personalities. By erasing his own image, he removed a critical entry point for analysis. Born in Germany and raised partly in exile in the Soviet Union, Wolf was shaped by both German culture and Soviet intelligence doctrine. This dual background made him exceptionally valuable to the KGB. He understood Western thinking, spoke fluent languages, and possessed an instinct for long-term strategic planning. When he took control of East Germany's Foreign Intelligence Service, he transformed it into one of the most effective intelligence organizations in the world. The CIA soon realized that many of its most serious counterintelligence failures in Europe traced back, directly or indirectly, to Wolf's operations. What made Wolf particularly dangerous in the eyes of the CIA was not a single spectacular operation, but his ability to penetrate institutions that were supposed to be secure. Under his leadership, East German intelligence placed agents deep inside NATO, West German ministries, and even intelligence services themselves. Some of these agents operated for decades without detection. They influenced policy, leaked classified documents, and quietly shaped decision-making at the highest levels. For the CIA, this represented a nightmare scenario. An adversary who did not merely steal information, but altered the strategic environment from within. Unlike many intelligence officers, Wolf avoided ideological speeches or public displays of loyalty. He rarely appeared in public and refused to cultivate a cult of personality. Instead, he focused on building networks that could survive even if individual agents were exposed. This approach aligned closely with KGB principles, and Soviet intelligence viewed him as a trusted partner rather than a subordinate. CIA analysts noted that his operations demonstrated a level of patience and discipline usually associated with Moscow itself. By the late 1960s, the CIA had reached a troubling conclusion. Markus Wolf was not simply reacting to Western intelligence moves, he was often anticipating them. His service appeared to know where the West was weak before the West recognized it themselves. Attempts to penetrate his organization repeatedly failed. Defectors provided fragments of information, but never enough to reconstruct the full picture. Wolf's system was designed to resist collapse, even under pressure. Inside Langley, internal assessments began describing him as uniquely dangerous, not because he commanded armies or weapons, but because he represented a form of intelligence warfare that was extremely difficult to counter. He did not seek confrontation. He sought invisibility, influence, and time. And in the Cold War, time was often more powerful than force. For years, the CIA tried to answer a single question: who was Markus Wolf? And how much damage had his operations already caused? What they did not yet understand was that the true extent of his influence would only become clear much later, when entire networks he built began to surface, revealing how deeply he had penetrated the Western world. As the CIA intensified its efforts to understand Markus Wolf's operations, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Many of the most damaging intelligence breaches in Western Europe shared common characteristics: long-term penetration, flawless cover stories, and agents who appeared politically insignificant until the moment their access became critical. These were not impulsive recruits motivated by money or ego. They were carefully selected individuals whose lives had been shaped, sometimes for decades, in preparation for a role they did not yet know they would play. This method bore the unmistakable signature of Wolf's strategic thinking. Unlike Soviet intelligence officers who often relied on ideological loyalty, Wolf emphasized psychological compatibility and social positioning. His agents were chosen not because they were radical or outspoken, but because they appeared ordinary, reliable, and invisible within bureaucratic systems. To the CIA, this approach was especially dangerous. Traditional counterintelligence methods focused on detecting suspicious behavior, ideological extremism, or financial anomalies. Wolf's operatives displayed none of these warning signs. They blended seamlessly into Western institutions, often rising slowly through professional ranks without attracting attention. One of the CIA's greatest concerns was Wolf's ability to exploit trust. Several of his agents were embedded in positions that required absolute confidence from colleagues, administrative coordinators, policy advisors, and technical specialists. These roles were rarely subjected to the highest levels of scrutiny, yet they offered access to sensitive information and internal decision-making processes. From Langley's perspective, this represented a systemic vulnerability. Wolf had identified the human weak points of Western security structures and built his operations around them. By the early 1970s, CIA analysts began to realize that Wolf's success was not accidental. His intelligence service operated with a level of autonomy and sophistication that rivaled, and in some cases surpassed, that of larger intelligence agencies. He maintained strict compartmentalization, ensuring that even high-ranking officers within his own service knew only what they needed to know. If an agent was exposed, the damage was contained. Networks did not unravel. This resilience frustrated CIA counterintelligence efforts, which relied on exploiting cascading failures after arrests or defections. The most alarming aspect of Wolf's work was his focus on influence rather than volume. He was not interested in flooding Moscow with raw intelligence. Instead, he prioritized quality, documents, insights, and assessments that shaped strategic thinking. In several cases, information obtained by Wolf's networks reached decision-makers in the Eastern Bloc before similar assessments were completed by Western intelligence agencies themselves. This temporal advantage allowed the Soviet side to react proactively rather than defensively, a fact that deeply troubled CIA planners. Attempts to penetrate Wolf's organization repeatedly failed. Defectors provided pieces of the puzzle, but their knowledge was limited. Some had never met Wolf in person. Others knew him only by pseudonyms or indirect references. This reinforced the myth-like status he acquired within Western intelligence circles. The CIA possessed detailed profiles of many Soviet intelligence officers, yet Wolf remained a void, an absence where critical information should have been. This lack of visibility amplified the perceived threat. Intelligence services fear what they cannot map. Internally, CIA memoranda began to describe Wolf as a long-term strategic operator rather than a tactical one. He planned in decades, not years. His agents were positioned to remain dormant until geopolitical conditions made them relevant. Some were activated only during moments of crisis, when their access suddenly became invaluable. This patience distinguished Wolf from many of his contemporaries and made his work exceptionally difficult to counter. By the mid-1970s, the CIA had reached a sobering conclusion. Marcus Wolf was dangerous not because he violated the rules of intelligence warfare, but because he mastered them. He understood Western systems better than many of the people who ran them. He knew where security was strongest and deliberately avoided it. Instead, he focused on the quiet corridors of power, where trust replaced verification and routine replaced suspicion. What the CIA still did not know was how deeply Wolf's influence extended, and how many of his networks remained active. That realization would come later, through a series of revelations that forced Western intelligence agencies to confront the true scale of his success. And when those revelations emerged, they would confirm the CIA's darkest suspicions. Marcus Wolf had not merely infiltrated the West, he had reshaped the intelligence battlefield itself. The true scale of Marcus Wolf's impact on Western intelligence began to surface in the late 1970s and early 1980s, when several long-running penetration cases were finally exposed. Each revelation sent shockwaves through the CIA and its allied services. What disturbed analysts most was not merely the presence of spies, but how deeply and quietly they had operated. These individuals were not fringe informants. They were trusted insiders who had spent years, sometimes decades, shaping policy discussions, handling classified materials, and influencing strategic decisions without ever triggering suspicion. One of the defining characteristics of Wolf's networks was their longevity. Many of his agents were recruited early in life, trained patiently, and allowed to mature professionally before being tasked with meaningful intelligence collection. From the CIA's perspective, this represented a catastrophic failure of counterintelligence assumptions. Western services expected espionage to leave traces, financial irregularities, ideological signals, or behavioral deviations. Wolf's agents exhibited none of these patterns. They lived normal lives, built careers, and raised families. all while quietly fulfilling their intelligence roles when required. As more cases emerged, the CIA began to recognize a consistent methodology behind them. Wolf avoided recruiting individuals who were already politically radicalized or financially desperate. Instead, he focused on those motivated by identity, loyalty, or personal conviction, factors far more difficult to detect or disrupt. Some agents did not even consider themselves spies in the traditional sense. They viewed their actions as contributions to stability, peace, or historical justice. This psychological framing made them exceptionally reliable and resistant to defection. The CIA also realized that Wolf had mastered the art of delayed activation. Many agents remained inactive for long periods, passing little or no intelligence. This dormancy protected them from exposure and allowed them to blend deeper into their environments. When geopolitical circumstances shifted, such as NATO policy debates, arms control negotiations, or moments of crisis, these agents suddenly became active, delivering information precisely when it mattered most. This timing magnified the strategic value of their intelligence and amplified its impact. Another element that alarmed CIA analysts was Wolf's strict separation between operational control and political ideology. Although he served a socialist state, he rarely framed intelligence work as ideological struggle. Instead, he treated it as a professional discipline governed by logic, patience, and human understanding. This approach appealed to agents who might have resisted overt propaganda. It also allowed Wolf's service to operate with remarkable flexibility, adapting to changing political conditions without internal disruption. The CIA's attempts to map Wolf's command structure repeatedly failed. His organization functioned without the rigid hierarchies common in many intelligence services. Decision-making authority was distributed carefully, minimizing the risk that any single arrest could compromise the whole system. Even when agents were exposed, their handlers often disappeared without a trace, leaving investigators with no clear path upward. This lack of exploitable structure deeply frustrated Western counterintelligence officers. By this stage, Marcus Wolf had become more than an intelligence officer in CIA assessments. He was viewed as an architect of a system that challenged Western assumptions about espionage itself. His work demonstrated that the greatest threat did not come from aggressive intelligence collection, but from quiet integration. He showed that influence could be exerted not by stealing secrets en masse, but by placing the right individuals in the right positions and waiting. Internally, CIA analysts began reassessing their own vulnerabilities. Reports emphasized that Wolf's success was made possible not only by his skill, but by Western complacency. Open societies relied heavily on trust, institutional continuity, and the assumption that threats would reveal themselves through abnormal behavior. Wolf exploited these assumptions relentlessly. He understood that the most secure systems were often blind to threats that looked ordinary. By the early 1980s, the CIA no longer questioned why Marcus Wolf was considered dangerous. The question had evolved into something more unsettling: how many of his operations had succeeded without ever being detected, and how much of the Cold War's strategic landscape had been shaped by decisions, influenced directly or indirectly by intelligence networks the West never knew existed? The answers to those questions would only become clearer after the Cold War ended, when Wolf himself stepped out of the shadows and the archives of both sides began to open. But by then, the damage and the lesson had already been written into history. The collapse of the Eastern Bloc in 1989 marked a turning point, not only for Europe, but for intelligence services on both sides of the Cold War. As the Berlin Wall fell and East Germany unraveled, Marcus Wolf made a decision that stunned Western intelligence agencies. He stepped out of the shadows voluntarily. For the CIA, this moment was both revelatory and deeply unsettling. The man they had chased for decades without a face now appeared in public interviews, calmly describing a career they had never fully understood while it was unfolding. When Western agencies finally obtained confirmed photographs and biographical details, analysts were struck by how ordinary Wolf appeared. There was no dramatic aura, no visible signs of the power he once wielded. This only reinforced what made him dangerous in the first place. Wolf did not rely on intimidation or spectacle. He relied on systems, discipline, and a deep understanding of how people function inside institutions. His appearance confirmed a painful truth for the CIA. The most effective intelligence operators often look nothing like the stereotypes built around them. As German reunification progressed, Western investigators gained access to portions of the Stasi archives. What they found confirmed many of their worst fears. Wolf's organization had maintained extensive files on Western politicians, military officers, and intelligence personnel. The scale of penetration was staggering. Agents had operated inside NATO structures, defense ministries, and intelligence-adjacent institutions for years. Some had influenced policy discussions without ever directly passing classified documents. The CIA realized that Wolf's impact extended beyond stolen secrets. It had shaped strategic assumptions in subtle but lasting ways. Yet what surprised CIA analysts most was the restraint evident in Wolf's operations. The archives showed that many opportunities for exploitation were deliberately ignored. Wolf avoided actions that might provoke suspicion or destabilize his networks prematurely. He prioritized endurance over immediate gain. This long-term restraint explained why his operations remained effective for so long. In contrast, many Western intelligence efforts during the same period were driven by short-term objectives and political pressure for quick results. During post-Cold War interviews, Wolf openly discussed his philosophy of intelligence work. He rejected the idea of intelligence as a battlefield of constant confrontation. Instead, he described it as a form of strategic observation, where understanding the adversary mattered more than defeating them outright. CIA analysts studying these statements recognized familiar patterns. Wolf had anticipated how Western agencies would think, what they would look for, and what they would ignore. He built his service around those blind spots. For the CIA, Wolf's public emergence created an uncomfortable paradox. On one hand, his openness provided valuable insight into Eastern Bloc intelligence methods. On the other, it highlighted how much of the Cold War had been shaped by forces the West never fully detected at the time. Internal reviews acknowledge that many counterintelligence failures were not the result of incompetence, but of structural assumptions that Wolf had deliberately exploited. The CIA also noted that Wolf never expressed triumph or regret over his career. He spoke in measured terms, framing intelligence work as a product of its time. This absence of ideological zeal made him harder to categorize. He was neither a fanatic nor a defector seeking redemption. He remained consistent, disciplined, and analytical to the end. For Western intelligence officers accustomed to clear moral narratives, this ambiguity was unsettling. By the early 1990s, the CIA had fully reassessed Marcus Wolf's legacy. He was no longer viewed simply as an adversary from a defeated system. He was studied as a benchmark, an example of how intelligence could be conducted with patience, subtlety, and psychological insight. Training materials and internal discussions referenced his methods as lessons in how deeply intelligence operations could penetrate open societies without triggering alarms. The question that now preoccupied analysts was not whether Wolf had been dangerous. That was no longer in doubt. The real question was how many of his principles remained relevant in a post-Cold War world. As intelligence threats evolved and new actors emerged, the CIA recognized that the vulnerabilities Wolf exploited, trust, routine, and institutional complacency, had not disappeared. They had merely changed form. And as the archives continued to open, one realization became increasingly clear. Marcus Wolf had not just played the Cold War intelligence game exceptionally well. He had quietly redefined its rules. By the time the Cold War had fully ended, the CIA's assessment of Marcus Wolf had evolved into something rare in the intelligence world, a quiet acknowledgement of respect. He was no longer viewed simply as an enemy officer from a defeated system, but as one of the most effective intelligence strategists of the 20th century. His danger, as the CIA came to understand, had never been rooted in aggression or spectacle. It lay in his ability to think patiently, operate invisibly, and reshape the battlefield without ever appearing on it. Wolf's legacy forced Western intelligence agencies to confront uncomfortable truths about their own systems. His success revealed that the greatest vulnerabilities were not technical but human. Open societies depended on trust, continuity, and predictable career paths. These features made them resilient but also exploitable. Wolf understood that counterintelligence focused too heavily on anomalies. By designing agents who embodied normality, he turned the West's strengths into weaknesses. This insight alone placed him in a category few intelligence officers ever reached. Perhaps most unsettling for the CIA was the realization that Wolf never needed to defeat Western intelligence directly. He did not seek to expose agencies or embarrass them publicly. Instead, he allowed them to continue operating under false assumptions. Decisions were made, policies were shaped, and strategic priorities were set without awareness of how deeply his networks had influenced the information environment. In intelligence terms, this was influence at its highest level, not control through force, but guidance through absence. Even after his identity became public, Wolf retained control over the narrative. He disclosed selectively, confirming some details while leaving others deliberately vague. This restraint preserved uncertainty, ensuring that no complete map of his operations would ever exist. For the CIA, this meant that the full scope of his impact could never be measured. Analysts were forced to accept that some intelligence, successes and failures of the Cold War might never be fully explained. Wolf's story also challenged the moral frameworks often applied to espionage. He did not fit neatly into the roles of villain or hero. He saw intelligence work as a professional, obligation shaped by history rather than ideology. This perspective unsettled Western audiences, but it reinforced why the CIA had found him so difficult to counter. Wolf did not act out of hatred or ambition. He acted out of discipline and belief in structure. Those motivations were harder to disrupt than greed or fanaticism. In later years, as intelligence agencies adapted to new threats, Wolf's methods continued to be studied. His emphasis on long-term placement, psychological alignment, and minimal operational footprint proved remarkably durable. Even in a world of digital surveillance and mass data collection, the principles he applied remained relevant. Technology changed, but human systems did not. Trust, routine, and assumption still governed institutions, just as they had during the Cold War. Ultimately, the CIA's conclusion was both simple and unsettling. Marcus Wolf was considered the most dangerous KGB-connected intelligence officer not because he broke rules, but because he mastered them. He demonstrated how intelligence could operate quietly beneath the surface of global politics, influencing outcomes without ever announcing its presence. His career served as a reminder that the most significant battles of the Cold War were not always fought with weapons or words, but in the unnoticed spaces where perception shaped reality. The irony of Wolf's legacy is that his greatest success may never be known in full. By design, his work resisted documentation, exposure, and closure. What remains is a silhouette, rather than a complete picture, a man whose influence was felt most strongly, where it was least visible. For the CIA, that invisibility was the ultimate threat. And it is why, even decades later, Marcus Wolf is remembered not simply as an adversary, but as a benchmark for how dangerous intelligence can be when it is executed with patience, restraint, and profound understanding of the human world.